the origination of...
We're actually on camera. Okay, today is July 16th in the year 2008. I'm Karen Herman with the Archive of American Television. It is my great pleasure today to be interviewing Sonny Fox here at his home in Encino, California. Okay, we're going to start right from the beginning and ask you, what was your name at birth? I wasn't kidding.
You would want to compromise me immediately, don't you? The name given to me by my parents was Irwin, I-R-W-I-N. I was named after my paternal grandfather, who had the unfortunate fate of dying a year before I was born, and therefore in the Jewish religion I could be named after him, and everybody adored Isaac. So that was a variation of that name.
And how did you come to the name Sonny?
Because I had a name like Irwin. You can't look into a crib with a little 3-week-old in swaddling clothes and two parents hanging over that crib and say, "Hi, little..." It doesn't come out. Doesn't work. So they started calling me Sonny Boy and I just grew up being called Sonny Boy. It stuck.
When were you born?
June 17th, 1925.
And where?
Brooklyn, New York. At home, by the way, I am told, because they didn't have anybody to leave my older sister with. So I guess it was delivered by a midwife. I was delivered by a midwife.
Is that where you grew up, in Brooklyn?
Yes.
What was your father's name?
Beg pardon?
Your father's name?
Julius Abraham.
And what did he do?
He was called Abe. I think Julius was his real name, but everybody in the Lower East Side was called Abe, so he grew up as Abe.
And what did he do?
He was, for the most of his life, a textile converter. Nobody will know what that means, so I'll explain a little bit. Textile converter was in the distribution stream between the mills that made the cloth and the end user that used them for shirts or dresses or whatever. And then he would get the order from the end user and then instruct the mill how to design it, how to print it, and so on. Never handled the merchandise, only did paperwork. Was in a little office and just processed all the paperwork through. So he was a distribution channel. Later, in later years, became involved in high-end carpet making, or sales.
And your mother's name?
Gertrude Goldberg Fox.
Did she work?
Not until she was 52. I mean, she worked when she was young, but she was a mother housewife, committee person. And then at 52, she started a theater party agency in New York, Claridge Theater, which still exists. And by the time she died, 30 years later approximately, it was the third largest one in New York. And people still, in the box offices, remember. I used to call her Broadway Gert. And one time we were having lunch in New York, and I said, I tried to convince her to retire, come out here. And she refused to do that. And I said, okay, but then the deal is, if you die, you can only die in the lobby of the Booth Theater or here at Sardi's where we were having lunch. And she said, okay, but you have to do my funeral oration. I kept my end of the deal. She didn't keep her end.
Did you ever get a chance to work with her?
No, but every Monday morning when I was doing my kids show Wonderama, every Monday morning I would get these letters. The following children must get tickets to your show. And so they were hard to come by, and I said, okay, fill it. And I said to her one day, Mom, how come all these people know I'm your son? And in a memorable phrase, she says, I don't know, it comes up in conversation. But she was great. Now, I think she probably sold theater parties on the basis that if you bought the theater party from her, I could get your kids on Wonderama. I think probably I worked for her, but not knowingly.
What traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
You know, that question is so interesting because it invites a larger question, which is what shapes us in life in any event. And as we go through some of it will become more apparent. But in terms of my early upbringing, I think Mom's insistence that growing up lower middle class in Brooklyn was not going to be our destiny. She had her eye on higher targets, different models, and she was the driving force in the family. She shaped that part of the family. Dad was much more accepting and much more willing to to stay where he was rather than be upwardly mobile. But she dragged my father, as well as the rest of us, along. I was the only kid in Brooklyn who, at maybe 10 or 11 years old, in the middle of the Depression, was taking elocution lessons. That was Mom. And the girls were taking ballet lessons. And she dragged me along because she didn't have anybody to leave me with. So I can do jetés, I can do arabesque, I can do pliés, because I had to sit there and watch them all do their bar exercises every week. So she was the shaping mechanism there. The negative of all of that was I don't think we were allowed to deal with what really was going on underneath, to really address what troubled us or what our basic feelings were. The marching orders in our family was, you got a problem, wash your face, brush your hair, and get on with your life. Just cope and get on with it. So that was another shaping mechanism which was there. And I still have some of that, which is sort of a very pragmatic, goal-oriented person that lies inside me. And I think that came from there.
As a kid, what were your goals? What did you want to be when you grew up?
I didn't have any goals, really, that were worth speaking of. I remember in 8th grade, maybe they had an essay about what you wanted to be when you grew up. I said, I want to be a textile converter like my dad, and I hope maybe someday to earn $10,000 a year. That was my frame. Swimming pools were in movies. One did not, in those days, imagine that one could achieve all those wondrous things that were out there. That was, out there. We could imagine maybe going to the next level, but not. I sure wasn't reaching for the stars in those days. So I really, when I look back, I'm totally amazed at the journey I've taken. But in those days, I didn't think it was going to be much of a journey. And the thing that changed that was the war. Well,
before that, what were your interests?
Getting through a day without getting beat up. I discovered drama, I discovered theater, I discovered reading. I love reading. It wasn't until I was a junior in high school, I think, that I discovered drama that I could actually perform. I finally found one thing I could do better than most of my classmates. And that began to really help me emerge from this thing. Yeah, I should reflect on the fact that my mother, in her pushy way, got me involved in a school career which was almost disastrous, because I had an older sister who was very smart, always was a student, something which is hard for a second child to cope with. Teachers would call my mother in 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade and say, your son isn't doing the work he's capable of doing. My mother's response was always, he's bored, skip him ahead. And they did, 3 times. So by the time I got into the 5th grade, I had no idea what was going on in the classroom. And I was a year and a half younger than everybody in the class, which at that age level, that's a disastrous social, disconnect. And that was a real thing that when we started dating, suddenly guys started dating girls or having spin the bottle parties or whatever we did in those innocent days, I was, the girls were 13 and a half and I was 12, for God's sakes. And when we were the 4 of us shared a locker at a beach in Brighton Beach in the summer, and when it rained, we'd go back to our locker, and they would sit around comparing how the hair was growing in their scrotum. And they would have lamps to check the hair around their scrotum. I didn't have any hair. I hardly had a scrotum. I was still in prepubescence. So it was tough. It was really tough. Also, we moved a lot. One of the things about the Depression, the way you survived was you signed a year's lease in an apartment, and you got 2 months concession. That meant the first 2 months were free. Didn't have to pay rent. And then you paid rent for 8 months. Then you stopped paying, and you got a dispossess notice. So you moved to the next month. So you paid rent for 8 months out of 12, and then you moved a lot. So I went to a lot of PSs, and in addition to being younger than everybody in the class, I was usually the new kid on the block. And that was also a problem growing up. Is everybody crying now for me? You realize what a poignant childhood I had. But I found my buddies on the street. Finally found my gang on East 9th Street in Brooklyn. And it was Alan Levine and Freddie Fields. Freddie Fields was the connector to showbiz, because Freddie Fields' brother was Freddie Feldman. I'm sorry, his name was Freddie Feldman then. Freddie Feldman's brother was Shep Fields. Now Shep Fields was a big band, well-known person. Shep Fields was big time. Shep Fields and his rippling rhythm. When Shep Fields came to Foster Avenue to see Mom, we would all line up knowing he was coming. And when he came out, he'd pat us on the head, "Hi, kid." And that was already the benediction. Then he would play 1 week on the bandstand in Brighton Beach, and we would stand there, shifting from foot to foot on the hot sand under the hot sun, waiting for him to turn around and go. And that was another benediction. So that was our connection with the world of showbiz. Freddie Feldman grew up to be Freddie Fields, a very well-known agent, producer in our business. But that was still a chimera. That was still a dream. That was still there. I never thought that day would ever come when I would ever be involved with that.
Did you go to the movies, listen to the radio, that kind of stuff?
Oh, every Saturday we went to the Leader. The Leader was on Coney Island Avenue and Newkirk Avenue, and 15 cents you got in. But I didn't have the 15 cents, but we would get enough bottles, milk bottles and Pepsi bottles. We'd turn those in, empty bottles, and then we could take the 15 cents. The show would start at 1 o'clock, and there'd be There would be 2 cartoons. There would be 2 serial dramas, 10-minute serial dramas, Dick Tracy or things of that sort. Then there'd be the Warner Pathé or newsreel. Then there'd be 2 features. And 5 hours later, you would stumble out. I remember I would have a splitting headache, be so happy. I had disappeared into this world of fantasy for 5 hours. And it was just looked forward to. But that was the only time I went to the movies growing up, was Saturday afternoon. Radio serials, absolutely. And I can still sing. Now goes back 75 years. I can still sing the theme songs from Jack Armstrong, All American Boy, and shows like that. And Uncle Don was the personality we all watched. Uncle Don was on local radio at 6:30, I believe, on WJZ, which was the Blue Network station of NBC in those days. And Uncle Don would start off with, "Greetings, nieces, nephews mine. I'm glad to see you look so fine. And how is Mama, and how's Daddy, and how are all those friends of mine? I've many, many things to tell you on the radio. This is Uncle Don, your Uncle Don. Hello, little friends, hello." Now, what was I, 7, 8, 5? So we're talking, 75 years ago. And that shows you how children's television or radio or anything, when you're a kid growing up, how that stays with you. That I can remember that. I can't remember what I had for breakfast, but I can remember that. And when I got involved in doing my own shows, it was sort of an interesting trip from the other side of the looking glass on that one.
Did you take some of those early childhood memories into consideration when you were
No, but sometimes I would reflect when I was doing personal appearances and kids were there dragging their parents to see Sonny Fox, that I had dragged my parents to see Uncle Don down on 14th Street at Hearn's department store, and how sort of interestingly, ironically circular all that was. I don't think I learned anything from those shows, but it was funny to sort of see that reality refracted into my life later on.
What high school did you go to? Which high school did you go to?
I went to 2. I started off at Erasmus High School in Brooklyn, and then we moved to Sheepshead Bay, and I ended up at Madison High School, from which I graduated. Want to hear those songs? I can sing you those songs.
And what did you want to do after you
I
graduated?
noticed you didn't say yes. Don't think I didn't note that. What?
What did you want to do after you graduated?
Good. Well, here's the situation. I graduated in February of 42. In December of 41, Pearl Harbor happened. I was 16 and a half when I graduated. That meant a year and a half later I was going to be drafted if the war was on. So what I wanted to do was sort of subverted by what I knew was going to happen. I remember listening in the kitchen doing the dishes after lunch on a Sunday and hearing the first bulletin about the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. Had no idea where Pearl Harbor was, by the way, but I knew my life had changed. And I was aware, I suppose, that my ticket out of a predictable life of going to school and going to Dad's business and living in Brooklyn or whatever, that life that I had sort of assumed I was going to live, that my ticket out of that was going to war, going into the Army, this great new adventure that was suddenly put in place that could happen. So what I was doing for that next year and a half was going to just sort of be, going to go to college, but it was going to sort of be a tap dance until I was getting into, so I went to NYU. I matriculated at North Carolina State to go to study textiles. But I didn't want to waste 6 months, and they would not let you go. They would not allow you to start your term until the fall, and I had graduated in February. I didn't want to waste 6 months, so I entered NYU and took courses I could translate the credit. And while there, they had radio courses, radio writing and radio producing. And I said, I'll take those. And halfway through the term, I said, ooh, that's really what I want to do. And then I had to confront my dad and tell him that his Sonny, J.A. Fox and Son was maybe going to lose the and Son part of it. He was very good. He really allowed me to do that. So I switched. But I switched my course then. But then I ended up, and sure enough, a year and a half later, I was drafted.
Can you talk a little about your war experience?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm being a little distracted. What's going on? Okay.
I had just asked you about your war experience.
Okay. What do you want me to do? The story of World War II in 15 minutes? What?
No, just basically.
Well, I was drafted, and I could. First of all, you have to understand, all my friends who were 18, of course they were my classmates, were long gone. And when I was with girls, they'd want to know how come you weren't in the Army, and I didn't want to tell them I was 16 and a half or 17, so I lied. College. So when the draft card finally came, when the draft notice came, I was thrilled that I was now going to really enter the war. My main concern was the war was going to be over before I could be part of it. That was really my main concern. And then finally, on October 2nd, 1943, I entered the service of the Army and chose, because I I got a high score on their testing going in, some special programs were offered me. The Air Force was offered me a program that... Where was I?
Oh.
If you got a high enough score, they had special programs the Navy had, the Air Force had, and the Army had. The Army had a thing called the Army Specialized Training Program, which said, you do 13 weeks of basic training, and then we'll send you back to college to study either Spanish or engineering. Well, I knew engineering was disastrous, so I figured Spanish. And I knew this was coming up, so in my last term at NYU, before I was drafted, I studied military Spanish. They gave a course on military Spanish, and I used to translate the reports from the Western Front, the Eastern Front that they had every day in the New York Times. I learned how to do it. I can still tell you that a machine gun in Spanish is a metralladora. So if you ever want to know anything about that, las bombas and things like that. And so I entered the Army, and I did the ASTP, and I went down to Fort Benning, Georgia, by the way, and was in the infantry down there doing basic training. The crackers down there, these little scrawny, red-haired, pimply-faced corporals were just waiting for New Yorkers to come down so they could harass them. And if you were a New York Jew, that was even better. And if you were, unfortunately, a fat New York Jew, that was almost fatal. But anyway, so basic training was tough, really tough. But it took me out of Brooklyn, decidedly, and introduced me to a part of the world I had never known, the South. And it put me into a context of a society with people I would never, ever, ever have encountered, with a rigorous training and discipline and isolation and so on. So I had to learn to cope with all the above. And then as we finished basic training and I was getting ready to go back to college, the Army decided they needed cannon fodder more than they needed engineers, and they discovered they weren't fighting any countries that spoke Spanish anyway. So suddenly they canceled the program. This happened to Bob Dole, by the way. Senator Dole had the same experience. And we were now thrown into the infantry, willy-nilly. So I then was in the infantry for the rest of my career. You want me to keep going?
Well, just briefly, because you were a POW and you did say that.
Well, I finished my training, and then in September of '44, we were shipped overseas on the Queen Elizabeth I, by the way. And then a few weeks later, we were trundling across Paris. Oh, when I was in Louisiana with the 86th Division training, that didn't work.
Okay.
While I was in training with the 86th in Louisiana, on June 6th, we heard that the D-Day invasion had started. Once again, I was fearful that the war was going to end before I was going to have a chance to catch up with it. But it didn't. Fortunately, it waited for me. And we got over there in September and trundled. I caught up with the war, actually, in probably late September, early October, in a place called the Hürtgen Forest in Germany. And stayed on the line there, and then in Luxembourg at a place called Hosingen, until the Battle of the Bulge started on December 16th. And then on December 18th, with the Germans 35 miles behind our lines, we had held our position, but they had sliced through. We finally were down to just a few houses, and my captain of the company, I was a staff sergeant by that time and a squad leader, my captain had not seen too many John Wayne movies, and he decided maybe it was time to surrender, thank goodness. So we did. So we said 11 o'clock, you're coming out with our arms up, and we had some Germans we had captured, and we sent them out to let them know we were coming out. And that began the next phase of my life, which was being a POW.
Okay. How long were you a POW?
Well, let's see. That was December 18th. I got out. I think we were liberated. I think it was. I can't remember. It was March 30th or April 30th. I think it was March 30th. About 3.5 months.
And you were treated differently then.
Well, it was in that camp. What happened was, first of all, when I came out with my arms up, I had two very distinct emotional states of mind. One was foreboding. I didn't know what I was getting into, obviously. The other was intense curiosity. I was about to go through the looking glass behind the German lines. I was about to see what was happening behind there. And, that was going to be a whole new thing to see. So there was both a sense of almost dread, but also a sense of real curiosity and eagerness to sort of see what this experience was going to end up being. I had already had the satisfaction, I suppose, of having proven to myself that under the extraordinary circumstances of being in battle and under fire and under the situations we were in, that I was okay, that I could handle that. And I saw some apparently stronger guys break under those pressures. So that gave me a sense of confidence, which I had not had when I left Brooklyn. Now I was going to a whole new circumstance. And we walked for 3 days and 3 nights to a railhead, and then we were locked onto a cattle car for 7 days and 7 nights. And on Christmas Eve, we were bombed by the Brits. Some of the people were killed. And we finally got to the first camp, which was Bad Orb, which is 9B. And when I got off, there were desks set up in the snowy hillside alongside the embankment where the train stopped. And they were taking the names of each of us as we got off and the information for their records. But they had assigned some Americans who had preceded us into camp. I drew one of these Americans who was sort of acting as a clerk on behalf of the Germans. And then the questioning started. It said name, rank, and serial number, which you're supposed to give. And then they started asking questions which you're not supposed to answer. And I said, no, I'm not supposed to answer those. And he looked at me and says, hey, they're just going to put you out in the snow here. and you're just going to stand there. Well, after 7 days and 7 nights locked on the car with no food and no water, that was not a prospect one relished. So I said, okay, my father was a textile converter, my mother's name is Gertrude. I didn't care. And then he got to religion. And so here I was, 19, standing in Nazi Germany as a prisoner, and was asked religion. But I think I decided that having surrendered once already, I didn't want to surrender again, so I just said Jewish. And he said, the American looked at me, he said, Protestant. And I looked at him and I said, Jewish. And he looked at me, he said, Protestant. And that was the end of that conversation. Didn't care what he had put down. I was finished with the interview. I got back into a place which was at least a little warm and some food. Didn't think of it any further until about 3 weeks later when the Germans came through calling off the names of the people who had been put down as being Jewish or sounded Jewish. And my name wasn't called. So then I realized he had put down Protestant. Then I had a second moral dilemma, which is, do I sit there and watch my co-religionists being taken away to a fate unknown, or do I stand up and say, take me too, I'm Jewish? So I rationalized that by thinking, oh, well, if I'm going to be able to help them, better from the outside the inside. Well, as it happened, some weeks later, all the non-coms, non-commissioned officers, sergeants, corporals, and so on, were moved to a second camp, including those who had been removed as being Jewish. We were all moved together to another camp, Camp 9A, up in Westphalia. So I would have been moved in any event. But those who were left behind were then sent off to work in salt mines, and about 80 of them never came back. They died they were actually turned into slave laborers. It was the only camp that is known of in World War II where the Germans actually did this. This was late in the war. The Germans were getting desperate for slave labor and so on, and I guess the word went out, take Jewish POWs, which of course was against all the rules of the war. But I heard about that. I knew some of them had been shipped out. I didn't know all the details until Charlie Guggenheim, many, many, many years ago, about 10 years ago, started doing a documentary on it, and so called me up, and we talked about it. And then he did a wonderful documentary, and then there's a book written around it. But the second camp. They tried the same thing, but there was an officer there, and he said, we're all Americans, we don't break, and refused to cooperate, and they backed off, they didn't press it. And as far as I know, it never happened to another prison camp. But in the prison camp, I had my ultimate, I think, seminal experience that changed my character. One of the things that happens to you when you first go into prison camp is you lose any sense of having control over your own life. You sort of surrender yourself to knowing that you no longer have any ability to control what goes on. You can't decide what to eat. You can't decide what to do. Lights go out. You can't go away. And so you sort of end up with this feeling of helplessness and surrender. But there was a guy in the second camp who was older than me. I mean, he looked very old to me. He was 28. And he sort of adopted me. And one day he said to me, I want you to shave and wash your socks. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but there was one razor for 240 men. You can imagine the blade. There was no shaving cream. There was no hot water. There was an outhouse with cold water, and this is January, very cold. And to wash your socks meant you had to wash them in this outhouse in cold water with just practically no soap. And I did. I took the razor, and I took my socks. It probably took me 20 minutes to shave, and every time I cut a follicle, it brought tears to my eyes. But I did it. And then I washed my socks and brought them in and put them on the little belly stove we had that was the only source of heat in the barracks. But what I did symbolically that moment was to take back control of my own life. I sort of was back in charge now. And I helped organize lecture circuits. And at night, the French had rigged up a radio. They were there 5 years, so they had managed to rig up a radio. And they got all the bulletins every night, what was going on the fronts. And the Frenchmen would come to a corner where we intersected, and one of our guys who could speak French would orally get the information, memorize it. Then one from each of the 4 American barracks, I was the newscaster from my barracks, would meet and memorize the bulletins. And then at night, when lights were out, we stationed guys at each door, and I would stand up and I would give the news of the day. Now, I have to also say hunger, starvation diet has a lot of effects. And one of them is the female organs that are inherent in men's bodies too, but are quiescent, start to become more active. The hair comes in much more silkily. The pitch of the voice goes up a little bit toward the feminine side. It's all very interesting things that happen when the body is starved. And I saw two guys having a fight once, and they ended up slapping each other. I mean, it changed that. And toward the end of the war, when the Russians were getting near Berlin, they stopped at the Oder River to retrench and resupply. So for 2 weeks, when I got to the Eastern Front, they were still there every night where we had left them the night before. And one night, the guy started yelling at me. That's where they were, they said, last night. You know what? And I said, and I yelled at them, if you don't like it, get somebody else to do this. You know, it was that kind of a thing. But finally, we knew the end was coming because we could hear Corps guns coming closer. And then the Germans told us we were to be moved out. They were moving everybody to the camp, going eastward away from the front. They didn't want us to be liberated. And we knew that that was going to be sort of fatal if we did that because we were in no condition to really do long hikes. The American planes were shooting up everything that was moving on the roads. They couldn't tell from the air that we were not German troops, that we were American POWs. So that night we spent organizing ourselves into 1/3 of the group was going to stay in their bunks and say we're too ill to move. The other group was to fall down into the mud. It was a cold, wet rain. And say when they wanted to move us out, say we can't move. And the third group that was finally moved was to jump the guards. The third night out, I was with the third group. They moved out the Russians, they moved out the French, they moved out the British, they moved out all the other groups. When it came time to our group, the guys stayed in their bunks. Then as they started to try to move us out, our designated POWs started dropping in the mud. I mean, it was brilliantly choreographed and carried out. The Germans were getting very pissed and shooting guns in the air. We didn't quite know what was going to go on. Finally, they allowed us to go back into our barracks. And the German guards left because they didn't want to be captured. So here we were in the middle of the barracks, nobody else around, all the other POWs moved out. And the German army was swarming around us, the defeated German army. And there's nothing more dangerous than a defeated army because it has no discipline. You don't know what they're going to do. So we stayed very quiet. SS came in at one point to rummage around where the Germans had been living so that they could get some food. We stayed very, very quiet then. And then about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the tanks came down, the American tanks, or the 6th Armored came down. And about 2 hours later, the first Jeep came in, and I was sitting on the roof by that time with our guys to see this whole thing. And when the Jeep came in, the first thing I thought of, it said, actually, my God, they're fat. Our guys, they're so fat. I hadn't seen, we were not fat. So the normal people looked fat to us. And we stayed there for another week and then we repatriated home. And during the repatriation process, we got the news that Franklin Roosevelt had died. He was the president I grew up with. And so I came home, but I came home changed. I left a skinny, uncertain kid from Brooklyn. And I came home a much different person.
What did you want to do?
Finished college, which I did in a year and a half. And then I got my first job with Alan Funt doing Candid Microphone.
How did you get that job?
I was bright, I was talented, and his mother knew my mother. I think that helped. No, as a kid coming in, I knew Alan. I had known Alan when I was a kid. He was the enfant terrible in the business. He was 26 and producing radio shows, doing advertising. And he was just starting up Candid Microphone, and I was the kid coming out of college, and I called him up after 3 weeks. I said, I need a job. He said, okay, come see me. And there were just four of us. It was Alan, Phil Pollard, Al Slepp, and me, and we sort of figured out this thing as we went along called Candid Microphone. So I did that for a year and a half. Tough first job.
Well, talk about that. How did that work?
First of all, the technology was so primitive. The first shows of Candid Microphone were done on wire. They didn't even have tape. Wire was a German invention during World War II. And now, the wire was very, very thin. It went from reel to reel, and it still had the same principle of magnetizing sound, but it went onto the wire. Now, to edit wire, here's the way you did it. You went through and you stopped where you wanted to do one cut. Then you took a pair of scissors and you cut the wire and held on for dear life, because if the wire sprung loose, it would tend to make knots in the end. Then you pulled the other side together to the end point, and then you cut that. Then you took the two ends and you made as small a knot as you could. Then you took the lighted end of a cigarette and you welded it. And that's how we edited Candid Microphone the first couple of 3 weeks. It was not a pretty sight, but we got it done. Later, then the Bush company out of Germany announced the arrival of the portable tape recorders. Well, it was portable. They were heavy wooden boxes that weighed about 80 pounds. You put a handle on it, and they said it's portable. That's what we used there. But it was metal reels, and the tape now was the way we know it in terms of this magnetized iron. But the backing was not cellulose; it was paper. Now, the paper tape and the metal flanges was a guarantee that you were going to rip that tape if when you stopped suddenly. And stuff. I learned how to put sentences back together now. So that was the technology. The setup for Alan Funt in those days, he was sharing an office at 52 Vanderbilt Avenue with an accountant. Their two desks abutted each other, faced each other. And then there were filing cabinets stuff. And then there's another adjoining office, which is where we kept the tape recorders, where we actually did the recording. But here was the way the deal would, somebody would come into the office, we would set up the hidden mics, and something would be going on, and this howlingly funny, improbable thing, and the accountant's working away doing his accounting at the other desk. It was sort of a surreal thing that was going on in those days, because that's all he could afford, given the money we were getting for doing radio network shows on ABC. I started off at $35 a week. I had a series of raises over the year and a half where you did the show, and when I finished, I was up to $65 a week. Thank God I was living at home. But it was an adventure. I learned a lot from Alan. I learned the meaning of the word chutzpah, watching him. And I said to him, Alan, one of the things he would sit at the desk and somebody said, and he would talk, and that would be a spot. And the mic would be a flat mic hidden under one level of Kleenex. That was it. I said, Alan, if they pick up a piece of Kleenex, you're sprung. I mean, the whole deal is over. He said, people don't pick up, it's like using somebody else's handkerchief. They don't do it. And indeed, in all the time we did it, nobody ever did that. Now, we got much more elaborate as time went on. We got much more sophisticated about how we did it. But we would sit there trying to think of spots. I would go through the yellow pages. What would be a good spot? And we edited and we helped write, and we all did everything. And of course, it was all Alan whose idea it was, and who kept it going for all those years. But we worked 80 hours a week, I think. And Alan was a brilliant man. He was also a megalomaniac and threw pencils at people and things like that. And it wasn't an accident that when we finished, one of the guys who had been divorced, his wife, another guy was in therapy. It was tough. It was tough. But every job since then seemed easy, I think.
What were some of your favorite gags on the show that you worked on?
Oh, I remember once we decided to call a locksmith to come up and break open a lock that we couldn't do. And what we did is we chained our secretary to the desk with a whole bunch of chains and a lock. And the gimmick was that she was a clock watcher. And so to make sure she didn't go to lunch too early, he chained her. And then, so here comes this elderly Jewish guy, And he says, and he was late getting there, so she was a half hour there, and so there was turning red welts on her. And he said, I'll get you out of here in a little while. And he says, and Alan was saying, well, what, you don't see this a lot? He says, what, turning it? No. He said, well, she's a clock watcher, and this is the only way we can keep it. And you don't see this? No. He said, and then the guy says, out west maybe they do this. When it was over, I had to run down to the lobby, and he was on his way to report it to police. I knew he was. Another time, same office, we got a steamer trunk, and we called a moving company to come up and move a trunk. And we put Phil Pollard, one of our guys, in there, and we tied it up with rope. So this guy comes up with his African-American assistant. And Alan says, okay, I want you to take this, and he gave him his own address on Park Avenue. Take this to the side and drop it off, and don't answer any questions. Just take it up and leave it, and don't answer any questions. He said that several times. Okay, so every time they went to pick it up, you would hear Phil Pollard inside the trunk going, Why is it making that noise? What noise? I don't know. Just get it out of here. And I'll give you an extra 20. Well, that tears it. And nobody gives you an extra 20 for something that's legal. And then Phil, in a brilliant kind of ad lib thing, they go to pick it up one last time. Now Phil starts banging on the inside of it. And the end of it was, here's your $20, take your money, I don't want to, it was this, and he was fleeing. That was the end line of this whole thing that built up. Well, I had to nail him in the lobby. He was also off to call the police. So these things would go on right in the office, right? And the accountant would try and start doing his accounts while all this was going on. So some of that stay with my mind. I stayed in the place we were living on, Hotel Seville on East 58th Street. Of course, my mother insisted we move out of Brooklyn, and there was no housing, so we stayed in a hotel. It turned out we were probably the only legitimate family in the whole hotel. It was mainly hookers and people in the hotel. I never had so many friends in my life as when I lived in that place. Sitting, they all used to come and sit at the bar downstairs. But there was also a switchboard, and we got stuff done with the switchboard. I mean, we were all over the place. You never knew where we were going to turn up. And anyway, so that was great fun and a great start of a otherwise checkered career.
Was there any talk of the show going to television?
Columbia Pictures asked us to do a one-reel or a 10-minute version, which we did in Grand Central Station. Turned out very well and played in theaters all over the country, and that started us down toward that. But I had left Alan by that time. I had come out here to California to work with, there was Norman Corwin, and there was this guy, and he was the other well-known writer of drama for radio in those days. He'd been to Africa and picked up some tapes, wanted me to come out and help him edit. So I came out on the Chief and the Century and the Chief, and came out to California in 1948. Lived in the hills above Malibu for just about 3 months. That didn't work out. And that's, and then I sort of wandered for a while. I wrote a radio comedy show for a little while, 5 days a week, half an hour, for a not terribly talented person. I did some advertising, and then I ended up with the Voice of America.
Doing what?
I was an English language correspondent. And that was a chance for me to really learn about my country. Because one of the things I did was trying to explain America to the rest of the world was to travel around this country and try to figure out what we could illustrate by means of radio. So I ended up in Butte, Montana, 3,000 feet under Butte, Montana, a copper mine. I ended up on farms. I ended up in Carroll County, Georgia, between Atlanta and the Alabama border, with an Indian farmer from India, for 3 weeks. In Yakima, in Columbia River Basin, with guys who are just migrants who are homesteading. I learned a lot about my country in that year and a half when I was doing that in this country, and then after that I became the VOA correspondent covering the Korean War. So I did my second war. And by the way, my advice to anyone out there: if you're going to be in a war, do it as a correspondent. Don't do it as an infantryman. Much better. So I spent a year based out of Tokyo and covering the Korean War for the Voice of America. And then I resigned. I had been married there and Japan and decided I wanted to leave and get on with the rest of my life. So I did leave and then took a 4-month trip around the world. Ended up back in New York, broke with a new wife and no job prospects. And that's when I learned that there was a new phenomenon in this country called educational television. I heard that there was a station in St. Louis, this was 1954, going on the air, looking for a producer and host of a kids show. I was never thinking of myself as a performer. I was a producer. I thought I'd probably stay in news. I didn't want to leave New York. On the other hand, I was broke, had this new wife, and needed a job. So I wrote them a letter. So this is who I am, this is where I've been, this is, they said, well, fly out, we'll give you an audition. And I said, I don't have enough money to fly out. And for some reason they said, well, we'll split the fee with you, we'll split the fare with you. So I flew out. In 1954, everybody was a folk singer. So I went to a friend of mine. I said, make me a folk singer. So he taught me 3 chords, and I learned to sing Froggy Went A-Courtin', which my daughter still does a dead-on impression on, which I wish she wouldn't. And I went out there, and I in a converted girls' gymnasium on George Washington University, that was the studio. And I did my audition. And when it was over, the guy in charge took me to lunch. He said, we've had a lot of people audition for this job, and almost all of them have been smoother and glibber than you. I said, why am I not surprised? He said, but whatever you're going to become, I think you're only at the beginning of it. So if you want the job, it's yours. 5 45-minute shows a week that you host, that you produce, $125 a week. Perfect. Flew back to home, bought a secondhand Ford, took my new wife, pulled up stakes and moved to a 4-story walk-up in St. Louis. And it was a while before the station went on the air. But it was an interesting group of people they assembled for this new adventure. And the people that were there at the station were really wonderful. We made great friends. And then I got to know the people at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and at the university. So it was 11 months of I really enjoyed it, except for the summer. The summer was terrible in St. Louis because when it got hot, I wanted to go to the beach. And there ain't no beach. So we went 90 miles to the Ozarks, to Lake Ozark or something. Didn't work. But at any rate.
That show was The Finder?
The Finder. Now, I use this also to teach people the meaning of the word chutzpah, which, of course, I had learned chutzpah from Alan. Now I'm using chutzpah on my own. I call up, it was the second year that the Corvette was being manufactured in this country, the big new sports car. And it was being assembled in St. Louis. So I called the head of marketing distribution in St. Louis. I said, here's the deal. This is before the station went on the air. I said, if you give me a Corvette for a year, free, we'll say it's, put the Finder on the side. I'll use it in my opening of my show. The Finder's going around finding things, bringing it back to the studio. And it'll be featured every day on a show, on a station which hasn't gone on the air, which is aimed at kids between 6 and 12. And we'll probably have a rating just a little higher than the test pattern. That's the deal. Now, I also teach the meaning of the word saying, he said yes. And suddenly I have this hugely overpowered car, which I took out once and opened up to 90 miles an hour and got scared out of my head. And I never did that again. But I would drive around the streets of St. Louis, the Finder, and this huge car. And once I was on my way to a personal appearance some evening at a school, and I couldn't find the school. And there were some kids out there that said, hey, how do I get to this school? And the kid looked down at the car and looked at me and says, you're the Finder, find it, and walked away. But it was a show which actually was the first show that kids show that was picked up by the Ford Foundation, which at that time had opened up an area in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to film or videotape these shows, I guess videotape them, and distribute them to other of these newly nascent stations going on there around the country that were then known as educational television. There was no network servicing them. So the Ford Foundation thought they would then take and make an exchange of programming. And the finder became, by the way, when they would show our pilot that we did for them, because we weren't on there yet, and I sang Froggy Went a Courtin' on the pilot, the word came back from the Ford Foundation saying, "We like the show, please tell Mr. Fox he doesn't have to sing." So the world, this country was denied yet another wonderful folk sing, another career move shut down. So we did that show we finally got on the air, and we were doing the show. About 6 months into the show, I got a call from a CBS producer saying, we are going to be putting a new children's show on CBS in next April. Would you be interested in hosting? I think the shortest measurable amount of time between a question and an answer was that. Between that question and saying, yep. They flew me to New York. Now, this is an example. I want to make sure that when we're talking about this, we begin to get the sense of what television was like in those days when we were inventing it. The joy of doing television was, we were starting out, for instance, when I went into the station, and we were the 8th educational station to go on the air in the country. So nobody knew yet what we were supposed to do or how to do it. We had ideas and so on, and certainly nobody knew about the kids yet. So we could try anything we wanted to try. We didn't have a budget. We had no resources, really, but we also had no restrictions. And so it was a joy to try to do whatever you want to do, and there were no rules or regulations, and nobody cared because there was no money in it. So it was like, play with that. We in television could pretend, we in the motion picture industry could pretend there is no television, because we see it as a threat. So as far as we're concerned, television doesn't exist. People in radio were making a huge amount of money. They didn't want to be on television because television wasn't paying. So therefore, we had this sort of freedom of playing around with this new technology that nobody understood yet quite, and wasn't really important enough yet for anybody to pay attention to. And that was the joy of being in television in those days. So here's the way I got my first starring television series. I got the call from the guy. I flew into New York on a weekend with my wife. I went up to 485 Madison Avenue, in those days the head of CBS. On a weekend, nobody else was there except Irv Gitlin, who was the head of public affairs for CBS television. We talked. He said, "Okay, I have a piece I want to look at that you did on your show." I said, "How did you get it?" He said, "Well, we have our ways." I said, "Okay." So we went, and it was a piece I had done on Lindbergh's trip, a solo flight across the Atlantic, and I did it because the Lindbergh Museum was in St. Louis, and I had artifacts and film and things that I could. So I worked on that a lot, and it was a pretty good piece. And when it was over, he said, "Well, is that typical of your work in St. Louis?" And in my most ingenuous way, I said, "That's probably the best thing I did there." So he came back to the office, said, "Okay, we start in April. It's sustaining, which meant there would be no commercials, and I can only pay you 3 1/4." I didn't have the guts to say 3 1/4. What? Month, week, year? What do we talk? So I figured, okay. And he said, and you have to get out here by February. I said, I don't have enough money to move. Oh, I'll have CBS move you. Great. He said, and go down and do your business affairs. Go down business affairs and make the deal. So I went down business affairs, and there's a guy sitting across from me who looked just like me. He was a New York kid. He was probably the same age as me. He was starting out. I was starting out. He talked to me for 5 minutes and realized that I had no idea what I was talking about. He said, "Hey, kid, you got an agent?" I said, "No." He said, "Get an agent." I said, "Well, who would you suggest?" So he suggested the same guy who handled Walter Cronkite, by the way. So those are my first agents. But he didn't have the gut. He didn't want to take advantage of me. He only wanted a deal with it. So I made the deal. It was $325 a week. I went back to my hotel to see my wife. I said, "You realize if we never make another buck in our lives more than $325, we're set for life?" I mean, $325 was a lot of money in 1954, 55. And so I flew back here, and in April of 1955, the first Let's Take a Trip went on CBS television on Sunday afternoon. There was no kids strip. There was nobody leading. We were leading. Our leading was Camera 3. Camera 3 was a double-domer intellectual show that CBS did that had a small audience of intellectuals, probably just people in New York and a few places like that. And out of that came this kids show. So this was really not what you would call ideal audience flow, but nevertheless, there we were. But think of this. I never took an audition. There was no pilot. There was no extraordinary, we just plunged ahead. Now, the other thing I want to explain is this was the first weekly remote show on CBS that I'm aware of was done. The guys who later went on to be CBS Sports technical directors cut their eye teeth on this show. We were still using studio cameras. We used the 4-turret cameras with the triangular base and the rubber wheels. I remember once we were doing a show at the Bronx Zoo, and we had to pan down a walk with cobblestones, and anybody watching had to take Dramamine because the camera was going like this as it went down. But also, this was a huge amount of equipment to have to unload and set up. And I remember once we were doing a show for Coast Guard Staten Island, and a rainstorm came through just after this. They would start setting up at 5 in the morning because we were on at noon. And all the cables got soaked. They had to run in, get more cables, reset up everything. It was guaranteed that at some point in the show, live show, one of the cameras was going to go down, something was going to go wrong. There was never a way, even after 3 years, that show got easier. Every week you were dealing with non-professionals who were on the show where you were going. We went to Ebbets Field. We did a show. I have wonderful photographs of it with Roy Campanella and Pee Wee Reese and Duke Snyder, and we did a whole show with them. We went to Notre Dame. We went to an aircraft carrier. We went to a rope factory. Don't ask me why, but we went to a rope factory. But it was wonderful. We went all over the country, and the same 2 kids every week, Pud and Ginger, for 2 years, and then Joan and Jimmy replaced them. And it was a lovely show. It was a lovely show, and I just had such fun doing it. And it lasted almost 3 years. But it was fun to do. It was really fun to do. In the middle of that, in '56, I started getting calls about doing game shows. First time I got a call about doing a game show or doing a pilot for a game show, I went back to Irv Gilton and I said, Irv, I really don't want to do game shows. I really want to do kids shows. So if you would give me money that I could use to develop new kids shows, I would say no to the game show. And he did. He came up with $25,000, which was a lot of money, to play with, to develop, just no questions asked, no contract, no. I said, I'll put $25,000. I said, great. Called up my agent. I said, I don't want to do the game shows. My agent thought I was out of my head, but 3 days later, Irv called me in. He said, I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed, but I have to tell you, I have to renege on that deal. What happened was, it was a Goodson Todman show. When they found out the reason I wasn't going to be available to them, they called up Paley and pointed out that CBS was a partner with Goodson Todman in the show. And what the hell were they doing when one guy at CBS was giving me a reason not to do the show that they were partners with? And so my friend got a call from Stanton's office saying, you can't do that. So they pulled it away from me, and I ended up doing some pilots for games, out of which came $64,000 challenge.
Let's stop there to change